Greetings. My name is Carly. I'm the host of the Magnifying Glass podcast. For today's solo episode, I will be focusing on disabilities in film, particularly 5 films. They are chiefly, classic films. They're from the 20th century. I'm a huge cinephile. I love old films, especially from like the silent era to the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. I just think those are the golden age of films, and they're just really well done and refined and more sophisticated than most films today, I think, probably because I'm an old soul. Well, for this one, I wanted to touch on specifically disabilities in films such as The Elephant Man by David Lynch. It's a very experimental, kind of a dark film. Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock, and Affair to Remember by Leo McCarey. So there are many films with disabilities, but of all these films, these are some of my favorites. I picked these ones off of my cinema shelf, and to explore deeper into these films, I was going to cover the film Wait Until Dark with Audrey Hepburn. It's a wonderful kind of a thriller film. And My Left Foot with Daniel Day-Lewis, but I think 5 films is a lot to cover in a solo podcast. But if you are keen on learning more about disabilities in film, I highly recommend Wait Until Dark and My Left Foot. So for the first film I wanted to touch on is The Elephant Man by David Lynch. I think it was made in 1980. It's one of the most famous. It won many Academy Awards. It is a black and white film set in Victorian era London, England. The film is about John Merrick. He has like severe disabilities and deformities, a lot of tumors. The film opens up with him in a freak show in Victorian era London. And Dr. Frederick Treves, a surgeon portrayed by the brilliant and wonderful Sir Anthony Hopkins. He's intrigued by John Merrick's severe deformities and eventually wants to introduce him to London society. And I think one of the most poignant scenes is when Dr. Treves, Anthony Hopkins, meets the Elephant Man for the first time, and his eyes form tears, and he's astonished. It's interesting how the whole camera just focuses right on his face like a portraiture. And I think it demonstrates that there must be a lot of internal and external pain that the Elephant Man experiences, and that he's displayed as a spectacle, not fully human, but dehumanized for entertainment's sake, which we see throughout the film. I think one of the most poignant motifs that is witnessed through the film is that there are tears and crying, which I find very touching and heartening, as it shows that, humanity is fragile and full of pain, and there are hurdles and obstacles. I think it is important to emphasize this because it shows that others can empathize and bond and somewhat understand what John Merrick is going through with his deformities, and not everyone is able or capable to socially and culturally accept him into London society due to prejudice and not seeming normal compared to others. What I also find heartening is that Dr. Treves is the first person to slowly invite Merrick into London society and make him feel whole in some respect and human, giving him a nice suit to wear, feeling important and respectable, and making him feel human. I just find it interesting because just having that exchange set of clothes just helps build his confidence and somewhat hide his deformities, I imagine, as well. Or maybe not let him be so attached or identify with his deformities. So the suit gives him a sense of importance and respectability. And it's interesting because it has Merrick, to me, he's like this shy flower waiting to be blossom and open in the warmth of the sunlight. I also think Dr. Treves, to me, he kind of symbolizes a lighthouse to Merrick in a sense, because he's able to guide him, give him strength, compassion, and some hope. Lighthouses serve to warn mariners of dangerous shallows and perilous rocky coasts, and they help guide vessels safely into and out of the harbors. And that lighthouses can symbolize one navigation through life, such as an important person in your life who has acted as your lighthouse and has guided you through difficulties and hurdles. Thus, I think Dr. Treves is an important and warm character in this sense because he does help enlist Merrick and encourages him to speak, though it is difficult to do so at times. So Merrick is able to recite Psalm 23. It is an honest and vulnerable moment. He's able to recite with courage and not falter. I think it shows that he does have potential, but it took some work and time to learn it from him. Also kind of loosely reminds me of the musical My Fair Lady with Audrey Hepburn and has Eliza Doolittle. And Rex Harrison has Professor Henry Higgins. He teaches Eliza to speak properly and eloquently to fit into London society. And I think overall it is an interesting transition in terms of attire in the beginning of the film because Merrick is draped like an old raggedy clothes in the beginning, and he has a bag over her head, and he has like one little hole where you can just see out. He pretty much cloaks himself up because he does not want others to shriek and whisper odd things about his deformed appearance and overall, head for the hills. So I imagine there must be a pang of vulnerability and overall complete lack of self-esteem with not being able to show your own face to the open crowd, as if you're simply not worthy of being seen at all, and that he belongs solely in a freak show in some, sequestered place and feels shunned and isolated, all on his own. Yet, though he may appear to look different and not normal in some respect, he's still human after all. He still has compassion. He has a personality. He has desires and wants and feelings. He wants to feel accepted and socially bond with others, irrespective of his disabilities and deformities. Further, as the story moves along and he stays in the hospital to feel more integrated in society and work on his disabilities. A very important and poignant scene, I think, in the film is this character Jim. He's a person who works at the hospital. I think he's like a cleaning person. It's like a lower class, rugged man. He exploits and uses Merrick as a means to display him as like a freak spectacle to make some side money through his friends and people in London, making a wild late night show of Merrick, who is kidnapped by his original owner, Bites, from the freak show, witnesses and reports this to Treves, who confronts Jim about what he has done. Jim is then fired by Mother's Head from the hospital. I think it's a chief woman at the hospital. And I think this wild scene of a spectacle is important because it demonstrates, even though Merrick is no longer in the freak show and is trying to feel accepted into society, he's still seen as a freak by Jim and others. And the disheartening thing is when the spectacle is over, Merrick, I deem, is placed on the bed lying down, and he has trouble breathing due to his deformities, and cannot sit up on his own until Jim helps him. It shows there's a sense of like vulnerability and helplessness, and that he does need to rely on others for his livelihood. But also shows that Jim does not care about Merrick as a human being, but solely as a means to make pocket money and display his deformities to the world, which is pretty gut-wrenching, I deem. It's just an interesting scene because it segues him being in a freak show and then he's not any longer, but people still perceive him as a freak. It's interesting because he's in the hospital in his room and there's people outside, there's a window in his room and they're all looking in like he's still a freak, but he's located in a hospital. I just thought it was an interesting geographical setup that way. It doesn't matter where he's placed. He could be sitting in Buckingham Palace with the Queen and people would still mock and shriek and laugh at him. I think another poignant and wonderful scene is the interaction with actress Madge Kendall, portrayed by Anne Bancroft, who gives him a copy of Romeo and Juliet. She's a stage actress. They exchange and play some lines back and forth. I think Kendall kisses Merrick on the lips. I think it's unique because in our minds, he's no Romeo in terms of the aesthetic look department. But Kendall encourages him to read and recite the lines of Shakespeare, and she can see past his deformities and see that he's a kind soul and is indeed human. I just think it's unique because he's not a beautiful man externally, but internally he is. So it's interesting how David Lynch set up that scene. David Lynch seems like a unique person, but odd. I think another important motif throughout the film is kindness, which we can see through several characters, and they have a social understanding of Merrick, especially Dr. Tree's wife, Anne, who is openly warm and accepts Merrick into their home. And she cries with him as he's not accustomed to receiving so much kindness and acceptance, and is indeed a touching and raw scene overall. Maybe a little overly romanticized and extreme, but I just imagine the hardship he must have faced, being in a freak show, not receiving kindness or acceptance because of his disabilities and deformities. It just switches the whole perception and outlook on it for him. I think another poignant scene is where he's conversing with Dr. Treves about his condition, and he looks up on the wall, and there is a pencil sketch drawing of this little girl sleeping in her bed. And you can see the moon, I believe. And John Merrick just gazes and looks at it. He's like, oh, I wish I could sleep like that. I just found it a very touching scene because he can't sleep normally like an able-bodied person. He has to sleep upright, or else he'll die or choke on his own. Like he can't breathe properly, I guess, when he lies down. It's just a touching scene, and it shows that maybe able-bodied people, we can take things like that for granted, and just not realizing that we have the ability to, walk or sleep properly for the most part. It just goes to show, like, I know there's extremes, but it just shows that we shouldn't maybe take things for granted. And of course, the most famous scene throughout the entire film is where Merrick cries and wails out in the public, hovering over him. I think it's in a station of somewhat. He wails out, "I am not an animal. I am a human being." And I find it interesting once he declares, the crowd backs away a little, as if realizing he made his statement and we have angered him, as if all his pain and prejudice over the years decided to explode like a Chinese firecracker, sadly. It is a gut-wrenching scene. Also, I think I read I don't know I think it was a scholarly piece on the Elephant Man symbolizes suffering and pain, and I think there was a comparison with him to Jesus Christ, just in terms of Jesus suffered and experienced a lot of pain throughout his life, and being shunned and not accepted into society for his beliefs and for claiming to be God. So I think there's some parallels with that in terms of suffering and pain and not feeling accepted. It was a really unique little scholarly article. I can't forget the name of it. Overall, I think this film is important and for touching on disabilities in some light, because this film is about the importance of looking beyond those first glances and understanding beyond those first impressions, being able to see through the person for who they are rather than what they look like outwardly for their disabilities, being able to understand, relate to their moral character, their personality, their kindness and overall demeanor. And this film does illustrate that wholeheartedly, as some of the characters can see beyond Merrick's disabilities and see his inner character and strength and inner human being for who he truly is, and not his outwardly appearance, which is interesting for the Victorian London era time, I think. Even though it's just imaginary film, it's just very interesting from a historical time period, I think. just in terms of in comparison today and in some respect. Also, another touching theme I've picked up from this film is that beauty is an important motif or theme. I think there's a scene where John is in his room and he's building this castle of St. Philip's that he can see across from his window room. It's a church, and he builds this artwork, this church, with just his, I believe, his left hand, because his other hand is maybe more severely deformed, and he only uses his one hand to create this beautiful artwork, which I think is interesting because it's very difficult to create art with just one hand alone, never mind having deformed disabilities. It's interesting because it, churches, I think, maybe symbolize wholesomeness or holiness or beautifulness, and John is able to see beauty in the world externally and internally. Even though he's not a beautiful person externally, he can admire a lot of beauty, especially with the stage actress, the church, the kindness of people. It's interesting how there's that irony or stark contrast that he's perceived as like an ugly person, but he overall sees beauty in the world. I think it's kind of interesting. And I think it's important to emphasize and accentuate in real life in terms of persons with disabilities, because not everyone with an intellectual disability or physical disability will feel accepted into society and may be judged at first glance right away. And those with disabilities obviously have no control over their disabilities. We were just born with it. Many don't want to be seen as vulnerable or beneath others, I deem, or and they just want to feel socially accepted and understood without facing prejudice, and for people of color as well. So it's a bit of a different topic. Further, it is interesting that this film is also not just full of prejudice, but this looming sense of fear with the presence of John Merrick, especially in the terms of the first act. His face is kept hidden for most of the time and is shown fearfully from a distance, and at a quick camera glance that snap away as if to avoid eye contact, and people avoid him as if he carried the Black Plague. I think it's an interesting that Lynch created this looming atmosphere of fear and this sense of horror and shock, even though it's not considered a horror film of suspense like an Alfred Hitchcock film. But he's obviously trying to create this looming, fearful atmosphere around John Merrick because he is an outcast and he should be treated with fear, disgust, and hate, with being shunned, not like a human in the beginning of the first act of the film overall. Of all the films covered for this episode, had the first one, I think The Elephant Man is probably the most bleak and poignant, I think, especially in terms of the black and white option for the film. It depicts that as well. I think maybe it's trying to exemplify that life is not all lollipops and roses, and it's not always colorful and vivid like a rainbow and liveliness and cheeriness. There are definitely bleak times in humanity, and that is what this film attempts to exemplify with Merrick's deformed disabilities. It is a film I cannot watch too many times due to the nature of being so bleak and difficult to digest. But Sir Anthony Hopkins, I think he portrays his role quite brilliantly and well, so I can watch it over again and again because of him. Overall, even though this film is a little romanticized and perhaps a little extreme in terms of disabilities, I think it's still an interesting and excellent portrayal for that, just in terms of the interweaving themes that we see throughout the film, even though it is bleak. Okay, in contrast, which is quite lighthearted and a romantic, easygoing film, is called An Affair to Remember, made in the late 50s by Leo McCarey. I think there's an original Affair to Remember from late 30s or early 40s with Irene Dunn that he made, but this one is a lot better, I believe. So it's with Cary Grant and Deborah Kerr. So this is a romantic film. It takes place on a cruise ship. Terry McKay and Niccolo are the characters. They develop a blossoming love affair on the cruise ship while they're both in exclusive relationships. When the cruise ship docks to New York City, they both decide to meet in 6 months' time at the top of the Empire State Building to prove that they're still worthy of each other and in love with each other in a romantic light. And also, Niccolo wants to prove himself he's worthy of working through being a painter. He has a lot of artistic skills. He's kind of a wealthy playboy, and he's never really worked a day in his life, so he wants to prove to himself and her that he can work and support her, and that he's able to develop a work ethic. And Terry goes on singing in nightclubs. She's a singer. She's a musician as well. So they're both very artistic. They are both able-bodied at the moment. Before the cruise, before it docks to New York, they both visit Niccolo's grandmother on the French Riviera while the ship docks. And it's an intimate moment, and Terry sings in French, and Janu, the grandmother, plays piano. It is a quaint moment. Both of them receive telegram letters from their loved ones and try to avoid photographs being taken. And they want to spend time together, but do not want to raise suspicion among passengers on the ship, given the nature that Niccolo is a well-known, wealthy playboy, man of stature. So has 6 months passed? We throughout those 6 months we see Niccolo develops his painting skills. He's able to produce a lot of fine artwork. He also paints billboards as well. So he becomes quite successful in New York. But on the day Terry's supposed to meet Niccolo at the Empire State Building after 6 months, funnily enough, she gets out of the fashion store. She gets hit by a car and is put in a hospital and cannot walk. And there's a likelihood that she will not be able to walk again and is placed in a wheelchair to navigate and maneuver the world. It's interesting because when she was walking to the Empire State Building, her eyes were so fixated on the Empire State Building, she wasn't paying attention of her near surroundings. So knowing that she's now wheelchair bound, she may not be able to walk again. The doctors are unsure. She conceals this new identity and accident of hers and does not let Niccolo know of her disabled condition, fearing she will not be able to birth children and that he may not want to marry her because she's wheelchair bound, and the possibility knowing she may not be able to walk again and perhaps birth children. She may not be able to be a good housewife or a mother. So there's a sense of vulnerability and doubt that impedes Terry from revealing the nature of her disabled condition. And also since she's saddened that a part of her womanhood is taken away. Her able-bodied ability as a singer, being able to go on stage, being able to attend functions and fashion in New York City and being a socialite. I think even for the 1950s in comparison today, there may have been some lingering prejudice with disabilities, especially in terms of, that traditional sense of womanhood needing to stay home and raise children and being a good housewife, being able to clean and cook and sew and all that jazz. That's kind of taken away. That traditional role is taken away from her at the moment. It's just interesting because she seems like a very confident, independent, outgoing person, but then once she's in a wheelchair, she just kind of confines herself and doesn't get out in society and things like that. She has like a lot of anxieties inside and stuff. But after the accident, she's given a job to teach children to sing. She's able to work while sitting in a chair or in a wheelchair, to lead the children to sing and prepare for their concert. So it's a very positive aspect of the story, I deem. She has all her intellectual faculties and her upper body movement and mobilities and vocal abilities for singing as well. I think she can get sick or weak at times though, because her body is still, very traumatized from the accident, so she has to take extra care and not neglect that care and well-being. One of the most poignant points of the film is when Terry and Niccolo both attend the same concert show, and Niccolo sees her as she is sitting, and when the show is finished, the tension between them, and he looks up knowing that she did not make it to the meeting at the Empire State Building, and she does not say anything but a quiet, abrupt hello, as she's in shock. And her friend says, "I can quickly run out and tell him about your accident, Terry. It's not a problem." But she implores him not to. I also think it's another important, poignant moment in the theater is when she meets Niccolo and he leaves. The entire audience just gets up and leaves the room, and an assistant in the theater rolls out her wheelchair, and the camera just focuses solely on the squeaky wheelchair. Feels like a looming, not a horror moment, but it's just, I don't know, it's a little, I almost find it a little eerie because we're just focusing solely on this wheelchair and nothing else at the moment. It's like the director really wants to emphasize what is happening and why there's a wheelchair. It's just this sullen moment of like quietness as the camera focuses on the wheelchair to mark her place. And I think it's a unique scene because the whole crowd is able-bodied and you ultimately expect everyone can just stand up from their seats with no issues and leave the theater. But we have this brief moment showing that Terry cannot leave her seat on her own and that she is dependent on the wheelchair. I think it's a touching moment, and the atmosphere almost gives off a quiet and looming, gloomy sense, but maybe not. The quietness of it all seems a little unsettling to me at first, but it's simply to highlight that disabilities are important, and that we need to understand not everyone is simply able-bodied and is able to leave the room with their 2 feet with no problem. It's one of the most unique themes, I think, throughout the film. So it is Christmas time, and Niccolo finds out Terry's address and goes to her apartment to meet her. And they visit and meet and greet. And he drops in to say hello. He wishes her a Merry Christmas, confronting her why she did not show up to their meeting on their planned date. Niccolo gifts Terry his grandmother's white shawl that she wanted now that she passed away, and they exchange some light conversation, and Terry is sitting on the sofa and she doesn't get up at all to greet Niccolo, which I think he catches on that's a little odd. He noticed in her other room, I think he mentions there's this when she puts on the white shawl, he's like, funny enough, there's this woman that was disabled and bought his painting with her in the shawl in it. And he kind of looks shocked, and he realizes, and then he looks at her and he walks over to her door in another room, opens the door, and he sees the painting and that it's hung, and she purchased the painting of the shawl, and he realizes as she's sitting down and lying on the sofa, she's the one that purchased it. And it's a poignant, romantic scene as Terry starts to get teary-eyed. It was the nearest thing to heaven, she said. She says if he can paint, she can walk, and anything can happen. It's a touching scene as he realizes her condition and does not hold prejudice at all, and tells, well, why didn't you tell me in the first place? And he does have compassion and understanding. It's like she sees her condition as a death sentence, and she's just full of fear and anxiety that he will not want her, he won't find her attractive any longer. Her womanhood is no longer worthy simply because she's not fully able-bodied. But he's like, no, he's like, oh, I care about you, and even if you can't walk at the moment, or if you can't, it's all right. I'll still be by your side. Oh, this film just makes me cry at that part, especially when she like says, "Oh, if you can paint, I'm sure I can walk again." It's like, oh, it was the nearest thing to heaven going to the Empire State Building. It's just a touching raw scene because he's very kind and understanding and he cares and he would not leave her side. It's like it's not a severe film like The Elephant Man, and the disability doesn't materialize and occur until halfway through the film or even a little after halfway, but I still think it's important because, especially in terms of femininity and womanhood, and as a woman, she's very independent, able-bodied. She's a musician, an artist. She relies on singing on stage and being a socialite and having that traditional sense of womanhood, and it kind of just all slowly gets taken away just in that one day. It just shows that you know, we do take things for granted and life is very fragile. I just think it's important in terms of like femininity because she viewed herself as a lesser woman in a way, like she wasn't fully a woman in a sense in that traditional light, and it just heartened me that the character, I know it's just a film, but she perceives herself as almost a lesser human being, and she just kind of wants to keep to herself and not go out into society too much, and she doesn't want people to know about her accident. So I just think it's, even though it's a romantic film and it's lighthearted and it's not severe like My Left Foot with Daniel Day-Lewis, I just think it's important in terms of that womanhood aspect, and especially during the 1950s as well. So if you're interested in a romantic 1950s film, I highly recommend this with a box of tissues. And overall, it's just important because, like, from a feminist or woman, standpoint, especially for its time, again, she truly does not believe she's fully a woman or has femininity anymore because of her independence, and womanhood is robbed from her. And she truly doesn't want Nickel or others to know about her condition. It's just interesting how her emotions just switch from confidence, independence to fear and anxiety and doubt, especially a lot of doubt. So it's just interesting how there's that complex character development and change with her personality. So I think that's important in terms of disabilities, because a lot of people with disabilities, including myself, there can be a looming sense of doubt or fear or not feeling accepted at times because of our disabilities. I guess an example, when I saw this film, because she's a woman and I'm a woman as well, I have difficulty hearing on the phone, even with hearing aids. Sometimes I can't really hear enough, or it's really difficult at times, and I'll have to say, "Oh, can you please email me instead?" because it's easier than conversing on the phone, simply because it is hard to hear. So sometimes I have like anxiety or doubt with that, like knowing, will I be able to hear this person? Sometimes I get a little embarrassed saying, "Oh, can you please email me instead?" Like, but most people are accepting and kind of like, "No problem if it's easier for you." But just small things like that. I kind of was able to reflect with Terry's character. Obviously not the extreme with her disabilities, but not being able to walk. But just that sense of that doubt or prejudice or anxiety, or how will people react to me with this disability, or will they be accommodating or understanding or not? But most of the time I find most people are, which is wonderful. Okay, so for the next film, it is called The Best Years of Our Lives. I think it was from the 1940s. It is directed by William Wyler. He was quite a famous director in his day. He did Funny Girl with Barbra Streisand, which is a little off tangent, but a wonderful musical I definitely cannot recommend enough. It won 7 Academy Awards, so it was made in 1946. This film is about three United States servicemen readjusting to societal changes in civilian life after coming home from World War II. The three men come from different services with different ranks that do not correspond with their civilian social class backgrounds. And the center character I will focus on for this piece is Homer Parrish. He's pretty much the chief main character, protagonist. He's a disabled war hero who lost his hand in the war. This is actually one of the very first films in which a person with a visible physical disability in real life plays a disabled character, which is why I wanted to touch on this film. It also stars Marina Loy, who was a huge 30s and 40s film star, especially in the Thin Man series with William Powell, which I highly recommend. So Homer Parrish, portrayed as Harold Russell, the actor, was Canadian. He was born in Nova Scotia. Yay! He actually lost his hand during a demolition training accident during his military service in real life, and was a U.S. Navy petty officer. In the film, he was portrayed as a high school athlete star living with his middle class parents in a suburban neighborhood with his younger sister. He's also been dating his next door neighbor Wilma, who intended to marry upon his return in World War II. So we see the film opens, Homer is asked to sign a document in order to fly back home from the war, and his army mate and the person behind the desk notices he has mechanical hooks. It's an interesting scene because everyone has their hands and things, but as soon as you see him about to write, he has these hooks that come out. It's like Captain Hook. And this one fellow asks, "Oh, if he needs help signing his name, I can help you." And Homer states, "You do not think I can sign my own name?" and kind of smiles at him. I think it shows that he wants to be independent and not rely on others for help all the time. And throughout the film, you see that he tries to be very independent, which is very unique. And the other two men kind of look at each other like they pity Homer for not having real flesh hands. They almost feel quite sorry for him, and he gets on the plane to go back home to Boone City. It's a fictionalized city. He's offered a cigarette from one of the officers and a match, but he declares he has his own match and he can light it himself without their help. He can dial telephones, drive a car, he can put nickels in a jukebox, he says, but he forlornly states he has a girl back home and he's worried she will not want to marry him now because of his mechanical arms. So even though he's independent, he has this looming, fretting fear that his girl will not want him. It just touches on his manlyhood and masculinity, I suppose, as well. I think this is an interesting scene because it shows that he doubts his girl will even want to marry him simply because he no longer has natural hands, and a sign of perhaps his masculinity is waning, and that it could make him seen as vulnerable and not as a breadwinner or protector for her, especially in the traditional sense of that historical timeline with after World War II. So when he arrives home, his family is happy to greet him, and they're all crying and they're cheering us as well. But when that settles down, there's this moment where they all kind of look at his mechanical hand, even though they don't want to. It's just a natural reaction with a sense of pityness, and it's like a gloomy scene almost. And his mother just starts wailing and sobs, but she's happy that he's back home, and he carries all his bags home and does not want any assistance whatsoever. The other two war heroes, they share the cab home with Homer. Once they drop him off, one states he sure knows how to use those hooks, and the other warbler says, well, they couldn't train him to put his hooks around his girl to stroke her hair. I thought that was an interesting moment. So there are definitely impediments and obstacles and limitations with what he can do now because of his mechanical hands. So in the evening, Homer is surrounded by family and a neighbor just greeting, celebrating his return. He's given a drink, but drops it due to his mechanical hands, and there's just a moment of embarrassment and anxiety and excuses himself to go for a walk. I think he was embarrassed and frustrated that he could not hold his own glass, but it's not his fault. And so he just storms out of the room and he visits Butch, a local bar and piano man owner, and it's a dear friend of his. And Butch says, "Your girlfriend called wondering where you were," and Homer said he thinks he made his family nervous with his hooks. And Butch says, "How?" And Homer says, "Well, his father was cleaning his smoke pipe like he does a million times. But this time he tried to do it quickly and hides his hands." And Butch said, "Well, just give it time. The folks will warm up to you. It will just take some time, just like anything in life." And I think Butch is an interesting, kind-hearted character because he's accepting of his friend irrespective of his mechanical hands or not. He's just this warm, non-judgmental character. He cares about Homer, and the hooks do not bother him at all. I think he actually teaches him piano later in the film with the hooks. He's able to like play piano somewhat, which is interesting. There's also this interesting scene with Homer. He becomes more isolated and lonely and frustrated with his new hand, and I don't think he's working at the moment. He's just trying to readjust to civilian life, and he keeps to himself mostly, and he avoids Wilma, his girlfriend. And he's in the garage, and Wilma comes to visit him and talks to him, and he just seems like he's in a lot of pain. And outside the window, there are children looking through the window at him. He's like, "What? Are you staring at these?" And he lifts up his mechanical hand and he gets so angry he smashes the window. "Look at these," he said. And the children just get frightened. They start crying and they run away. And he kind of regrets doing that. Kind of slightly reminded me of the Elephant Man, just in terms of not a spectacle, but it's just different from like able-bodied people. It's just kind of a jarring scene because he does like smash his hand through the glass and it just shatters. Like this moment of like anger and fear and frustration and denial all in one scene. It's a little traumatizing. Also, there's another poignant scene is where Homer brings Wilma up to his room to show how dependent he is now, and he needs someone to button up his clothes and his pajama and dress him in some light. He isn't a fully independent person anymore. That's taken away because of his hands. It's just interesting because he's so vulnerable now, and he's trying to illustrate that to Wilma. You're not going to want to marry me because you're going to have to help dress me every day. Take my hooks off. And he's like, if the door shuts, I can't open it because if my hooks are off, I can't put them back on again by myself. So the door has to be opened ajar, or there has to be someone in the room, when he's sleeping, or else he can't get out, and he's vulnerable that way. And he's just like, well, you're going to have to take care of me in the sense that that's going to be a chore or exhausting for you, he said. And Wilma just looks at him like, no, it's fine. I can accept that. I can do that for you. It's not a problem because she cares about him. It's just a touching scene because there's this contrast of doubt and vulnerability and fear, and that she's not going to want him, but she's very uplifting and says, no, I will be there for you, and I will take care of you, and I will help you, and it doesn't matter if you have mechanical hands or not. And they share a warm embrace and kiss, I believe. And they wish each other good night, and he lies on his back looking up, and he has like tears streaming down his eyes. So it is a heartening scene. And they eventually get married. So what I find interesting with this is that it's just interesting because he was an all-star athlete. He can no longer do that now. That's robbed and taken away, and there's a lot of difficulty with adjusting with his new disabled life. And I just find he seems like a complex character because I find most people with disabilities in film that I've seen, not all, but there's a lot that are just so vulnerable. They're just seen as like they're just this wilted, weak flower, and they can't help themselves almost. And that they're just so dependent. But with Homer as a character, he's really striving to be independent as much as he can, regardless of his mechanical hooks. He very much wants his natural hands back, but he's really. It's just interesting how his character really strives as much as he can to be independent as possible, and he just really does not want to be dependent, and it hurts his well-being, I suppose. But it's just interesting how the story, I like how it opens up the very first scene. He's like, oh, you don't think I can sign my name? It just shows that that very first scene, like, even though he's disabled, he's very much does not want people to judge him, and he wants people to know he can be very independent in many ways. I just find it heartening and wonderful how the screenwriter or writer was able to portray that character in that light. It shows that even though you have a disability and there's certain vulnerabilities, you can still try to be independent as much as you can without people assuming that, oh, you need help right away because of your physical or intellectual disability. And it's just interesting because he does strive his best, and he learns piano. He can do certain things with his hands. It just takes time and experimentation and learning with what you can do with your hands overall. I find that a very interesting character reflection and development. So it's a heartwarming film. It's unique to me because it is one of the very first films where an actual disabled person in real life plays a disabled character. So there's a lot of authenticity and realness and genuinity with the character. So it portrays disabilities in a true, like, positive light in a sense because it is a person with disabilities. I just think it's important in that sense, just because he is a person with real disabilities. So maybe people with disabilities in real life can somehow relate to that character because it is real, and it is a struggle, and it is trying, and it's trial and error, but you can work your way around it somehow and be able to live your life with your disabilities, but strive to be independent as you can.
All right, last but not least, we have Rear Window, which was made in 1954 by Alfred Hitchcock. It's one of his most notable and famous films. One of my favorites, especially since I'm a photographer hobbyist, so it's all about cameras as well. So we have Hitchcock's classic and one of his best, at Rear Window. It stars James Stewart. He was a very famous actor back in the day. Portrayed as L.B. Jeffries, who is a professional New York photojournalist working for Life and Look magazine at the time, living in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. And in the opening scene, we see he's recuperating from a broken leg in a wheelchair. I think he's sleeping, or when the scene just opens up on him in his open apartment, and the film camera shines on his cast, and it says, "Here lies the bones of L.B. Jeffries." So he has a temporary disability. It's not permanent. And Grace Kelly stars in it, has his girlfriend Lisa Fremont, a socialite, and Jeffrey's nurse Stella as well. So he has a temporary broken leg, which is difficult for him to maneuver and navigate the world, because he can't work as a photographer at the moment and he must heal. It's not a permanent disability, but I think it's still important to highlight, simply because he is temporarily disabled and has troubles and struggles as well throughout the film. And the most famous scene in the beginning, he has to itch his leg in his white cast and he can't reach it. And he has to get this long stick, I guess, and reach down and get it. And he's relieved. And I think he's irked that he cannot go on any adventurous photography assignments, and he must be housebound until his leg heals, which makes him restless and frustrated and irritable. And he's just bored to tears because he can't do much. He seems to be always on his feet and taking photographs. He does have his nurse, Stella, for social company and help and assistance, and his partner, Lisa, as well, it helps assist him with making meals and things like that. So as time passes, he's just housebound, so he develops this voyeurism throughout his apartment window, where he can see all the others in the other neighborhoods' apartments. A peeping Tom, if you will, but it passes the time for him. What's interesting about this film is a lot of the neighbors are artistic and are artists in some sense. The one neighbor below, I think she's a sculptor and a painter. We can see her sculpt and paint. Above we have Miss Torso, he calls her. She's a dancer. We have Miss Lonely Hearts, who's like this suicidal old middle-aged woman, and she really likes music. Like, she has good taste in music, I notice, and she seems very like well dressed. And we have this pianist in the corner who is a struggling pianist to make up his own tunes. And then the neighbor across from him sells jewelry. It just seems like a very artistic film. And then the protagonist is a photographer. I just think that's an interesting standpoint with the film. It's not a disability angle, but it's just interesting from a visual lens perspective as well. So he becomes like a peeping Tom and just picks up on all the neighbors' eccentricities and oddities and what they do, and he just finds it very fascinating to watch, almost like a television program but live, and it passes the time for him. And I think his cast, it's seen as a cocoon from which he will emerge almost. It's like his cast is a symbol of his current impotence and inability to work. He's unable to like fulfill his lifestyle that he wants to do, and he's just sedentary, just unable to feel any attraction toward Lisa, I noticed throughout the film, even though she's an attractive woman and he likes her, but he just can't perform that masculinity or attraction duty towards her because of his temporary disability and broken leg, which I thought was an interesting point. It's like he just feels like he can't like maybe perform his duty or, care for her in that way until his leg heals. But she tried her best to seduce him. Also, in the beginning of the scene, it's interesting how the camera focuses on him and his leg. Then it moves toward the smashed camera. So it just kind of represents his current condition with his broken leg. So I thought those two juxtapositions of the camera and his leg were quite interesting. And while he's stagnant and he's housebound, he becomes, again, more naturally observant of his surroundings, more observant, and especially at night, when most people are in bed, he is just in his wheelchair looking out the window, probably because of his photography, intuition and senses as well. You have to, like, as a photographer, be aware of your surroundings and pick things up that you can photograph. So he has that intuition. And one evening he notices in the apartment in his place in Greenwich Village, he hears a shriek and a scream and a glass shatters at midnight, I guess. He notices the neighbor across from him, the one who's an elderly man who sells jewelry. His wife is an imbecile. She's very sick and needs extra care, and he notices the man just leaves in and out with his silver suitcase, which was very odd at like 3 or 2 a.m. in the morning, which he's probably the only one that notices it because he's the only one that's up at this hour. And the next day he notices that his wife is no longer there across the window apartment, which was odd, he thought. And the fact that his neighbor is named Thorwald, and he like had this huge like trunk with ropes all around it, and it was just, he just thought it was odd, and he's like speculating, oh, did he harm his wife? Because like in the open window he sees like saws and knives, and just kind of collects all these pieces and assumes that, oh, he must have slayed his wife. Moreover, I think the temporary leg disability is positive slant because Jeffrey is able to become very observant of his surroundings and neighbors, and picks up on the idea that his neighbor across from him may have murdered his wife. due to his odd behavior and his leaving in and out of the morning. So I think that's a interesting aspect of just his temporary disability in a way, just because he's able to pick up on all this. And then he's like starts using his wide angle lens camera to like snoop at the neighbor and look through his window and things like that. And then he notices like the next morning, Thorwald like looks out the window, like has a man who doesn't want to be seen or known he's been up to something suspicious. The other important thing I think with this film is that he does suspect that his neighbor did slay his wife, and he calls in his friend who's from the war, who's a detective. And the fact that his war friend doesn't believe him, like he thinks, oh, you're just a nutcase because you're just, alone in your chair and you don't have much to do. He's like, it doesn't mean that she was murdered. And then the detective investigates in him and said, no, his wife went on a train. There was witnesses she went to visit a relative, and things still don't know to add up to Jeffrey. He later asked Stella to follow the trunk with the ropes to go out and get the name of the truck, where the trunk went and things like that. Or I think he would ask Lisa and Stella to snoop on his mailbox and things like that, because he can't do it himself. So in a way, he has to rely on others to piece all the information and things like that, which I think is interesting. It's interesting because he's like disabled in a way, and he's just sitting in this, wheelchair, and he picks up on all of these social cues and things like that towards his neighbor, and he's able to, file these missing puzzle pieces together, if you will. I just think it's interesting from that perspective, though it is just a film. And I think Stella and Lisa have a hard time believing him at first, but then Lisa notices that the trunk with the rope. She's like, oh, well, Jeff, tell me everything you saw from the beginning. And then she tells him everything, and then she starts to believe it. And interesting from a femininity or female standpoint is that I think they both notice Thorwald is holding his wife's purse with all her jewelry and, intimate things. And then Lisa's like, I don't think a woman would leave behind her purse and all her jewelry and things like that. So she thought that was odd, like a woman naturally wouldn't do that. And I think she eventually breaks into his apartment, and she finds the woman's wedding ring is in there, which is odd. She's like, no woman would, leave behind her wedding ring or purse or things like that. And then she gets caught, and Thorwald's there, but then Jeffrey called the police, and they come in time and take Lisa away for burglary, and luckily she wasn't, harmed or slayed. One of the most bone-chilling scenes is when that happens. Thorwald, Lisa screams, Jeff, help! And then Thorwald, because she screamed out the window, like towards him, and Thorwald, like, oh, he picked up on that, and he darted his eyes right across to Jeffrey's room. He's like, oh, someone's been watching me, because they sent a note to him, I know what you did, and he looked so frightened. And then, yeah, Lisa's taken away. I think Jeffrey called his detective friend about it, and Thorwald notices, oh, I've been watched. He leaves his room, and then Jeffrey looks back, and his room is like pitch dark, like, oh crap. And then we slowly hear the door like shut in his other side of his apartment, and he gets like a phone call, and there's like no answer. And then he climbs up the stairs, and like you can hear these thudding footsteps, like had the Grim Reapers coming, and Jeffrey gets quite nervous and apprehensive, and he like wheels his chair back in the dark, like has a silhouette, and he gets his like one of his cameras and gets a flash out, and Thorwald like comes in. He's like, what do you want from me? I don't have money. And he wants to like harm Jeffrey. Then he just like walks towards him, and he like just keeps wheeling his wheelchair back, and he starts getting the flash camera and just like starts flashing and flashing at him, and he like blinds his eyes for a minute, which I thought was interesting. It works for a little bit, but then Thorwald like pushes him out the window, and he like falls down, but Thorwald is caught by his detective friend and everyone, and he admits, oh, I slayed my wife. So And then the very next scene, the day we see Jeffrey, it now has 2 casts on him. So he's like double temporary disabled. And then Lisa's like there reading a fashion magazine. Maybe it's not like the best film for like depicting disabilities, just because it is like a Hitchcock film and it's like, it's just temporary. But I just think it's still interesting, like just because he is like temporary disabled, he's still able to pick up all these mysterious cues and pieces. And he wouldn't be able to realize they're the murder simply because he has a temporary disability, because if he was able-bodied and working, maybe no one would pick up on these cues. So in a way, it's kind of like a positive slant, I guess. And the fact he does have to rely on others to build these cues, because he can't go there himself to his neighbors and find out more information about him. I just think it's interesting. And I think of the other film that I touched on, of all of them, there's a sense of isolation, sense of loneliness. You have to kind of be by yourself. Or there's a sense of frustration, right? This looming frustration, like, oh, I don't want this disability. I did not ask for it. It's of all these films, there's this interweaving theme, right? That they're struggling and they don't want this disability. They don't know how to work around it. They just want to move on with their lives. It's just interesting to me because they all have different disabilities in a sense, but they all share this sense of frustration and loneliness and isolation and wanting to be understood in some light.